Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again on Itamar. It is Thursday, not Friday. I'm trying to get a lesson a little earlier this time for your benefit, so maybe those of you who want to study before Shabbat will have an opportunity and preparing yourselves for the weekly portion a little earlier. But today, of course, I want to focus. I can't skip over the amazing holiday that we have today, that coming up this week on Shabbat, as a matter of fact, is the holiday of Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is one of the 4 New Years that I mentioned in our oral law. Of course, the famous New Year everyone knows is Tishrei, when everyone is judged the first day of Tishrei. You know, the month of the 7th month of the year. That's really the first of most famous New Year that everyone recognizes. And there's also the New Year of months, which is the month of Nisan, which everyone knows. Less people know the month of Elul, the first of Elul, which is the New Year for animals, the tithe given to animals. Less people know that. And of course, there is a New Year for trees, which is coming up this Shabbat. We all know it's a very special thing to plant trees, and I want to invite everyone who wants to plant a tree on Itamar to please just email us and say we want to plant a tree on Itamar, and we will, of course, allow you to do that. Just contact us, and every year it's a blessing to have people plant trees, and we believe that planting trees connects us to the ground, makes us root ourselves into the ground, and digs us even deeper into the land of Israel. So please, feel free to contact me about that. Anyway, let's get right down to the New Year, and I'd like to connect it to this week's portion. So what does Tu B'Shvat mean? What does it all mean, Tu B'Shvat? The 15th day of the month of Shvat is a new year. How is it a new year? Well, think about it. A new year means a new beginning, right? We're starting something new. And what does that mean? We know that there's a 7-year cycle of the sabbatical year. Every 7 years we have a sabbatical year, which land must be fallow and rest. One cannot work the ground, and many, many things that are prohibited on that year to do with the ground. Just like we rest on the Sabbath, the land must rest on the 7th year. But of course, there are something besides resting, and what that's called eating. We must always eat, and therefore, Hashem allows us to partake of the fruit. But it's like everyone's like part of those fruit in the sabbatical year, and we can all partake of those fruit freely. Or let the animals of the field enjoy and have, enjoy from the fruit. So it's a very special year. And that's the sabbatical year. But what happens for the first 6 years of that, until we get to the 7th year, there are laws of tithes. That the year, of course, we're allowed to work, we work very hard, but of course, we have to always remember that everything comes from Hashem, and that we have to always, everything we do in this world, everything physical and materialistic in this world, we always pay tribute to Hashem in everything we do. And that, of course, is the tithes we must separate out during the 6 years. Every year differs a little bit, really not every year, but the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th years have certain tithes. And on the 3rd and 6th year, there are certain tithes. There are some tithes which are the same in both years, but there are some differences between those two different parts of the 6-year cycle, which I don't want to get complicated here, but I want to try to explain a little bit. I think I've done this in the past, but of course it's always good to review Torah and to go over Torah. Number one, a lot of people will go to a store, in Brooklyn, New York, and they'll buy some cherries. Wow, I was just there recently, and the cherries are great in America. But of course, we don't have to worry about taking tithes and separating out for the priests and for the poor people, because when you're living outside the land of Israel, there are no laws that apply to the land. Only when you're living in Israel, the laws apply to the land. And that's very special. It's something called in Hebrew, mitzvot hatliyot ba'aretz. Special commandments that apply, which are dependent upon the land. The land makes the requirement when you're living here. Okay, so I'm inviting you to move to Israel, right? Here you can do it. But anyway, for example, the first year of the cycle, we have 2 important tithes, and the first important tithe of the first year, which is in every year really, is called Terumah. What is Terumah? Terumah is what the priests get. They get something called the Terumah, which means, let's say I have a big stack of 100 apples I just picked off my apple tree. I have to give a certain amount of those apples to a Kohen, to the priest. And if we were living in the times where Kohanim were allowed to partake of the fruit, because today we have a problem, another additional problem is that we don't have the red heifer, and all Kohanim today are unclean, and therefore they can't really eat food because it's holy, eating holy food. So we would give, in those times when they were allowed to partake of the Trumah, we would separate out a portion of around, let's say, a 50th, which is 2%, we would give to the Kohen. Nowadays, since he can't eat it anyway, we only separate out a small amount. A little fraction is enough to give to the Kohen today, but it must be given. Now, it must be separated out. Even before we give it to a Kohen, we have to separate it out of our fruit. So if I would have these 100 apples in front of me, I would pick a little bit off of an apple, a little bit more than a percentage on that apple, let's say, and I would say the little bit more than 1%, I would call that truma. And that would be separated for that purpose. That 1% that remains, what would I do? Why did I say the 1%? Because I take that little 1% and I'll add it to another 9% of those apples, which means whatever is left is 100 apples, a little more than 1% is the truma. The 1%, right, plus another 9% of those apples, of the 100 apples, for example, give an example, all that together would be 10%. So that 10% would be something we would call the tithes for the Levites. And that will be separate aside for the Levites. Out of that 10% we give to the Levites, the Levites have to give also 1% to that, something called Maaser min Maaser, which means 10th of a 10th. So they have to give one apple out of the 10 apples, let's say, they have to give that one apple to a priest as well. So we have within this, we separate aside a little bit more than 1%. So a little bit more than 1% would be the truma. That 1% would be the tithe that the Levi would have to give to the Kohen. And the reason we separate that aside today when we do the law is because those two things, one cannot partake of eating it. But the Levite's portion, someone's allowed to eat it, of course. So if someone knows a Levite and he wants to give it to a Levite, he give it to a Levite as well. And once that's separated aside, we have additional 10% which we have to worry about on the first year, or the second year, or the fourth year, or the fifth year. And that's something called Maaser Sheni, the second tithe. The second tithe was, we would take out of these, again, what was left, another, let's say 90 apples were left after we separated it out. So we take 9 apples, 10% of that 90 would have to be separated out and to be taken to the holy city of Jerusalem and eaten in Jerusalem. Because they would have a special, again, we'd have to eat them with being clean, and today we have a problem cleaning ourselves, and etc. So it doesn't apply again. What we have to do today, since we can't eat in Jerusalem, we redeem it on a coin, a special coin that we set aside for the purpose of redeeming the tithes, and that is redeemed on the coin. So we say, for example, we first call a name for we say on the southern side of these apples, this is called the second tithe, and the second tithe we're going to redeem it on a coin that I've set aside, and then the holiness of those, or the holiest value of those apples goes over to the coin, and then the apples are allowed to be eaten by us today. And this is all we have to do every time those who live again, don't live in a city, which they buy just vegetables and fruit that are already separated out by the rabbis or the mashgichim that are watching over, so they don't really know about doing the laws. But those of us who live on places like Itamar in the mountains over here of Shomron, we have to, of course, deal with these laws every single day as we grow our fruit and vegetables. We have to deal with it. For example, if you're looking right now at this beautiful lemon tree of mine, I'm looking at it, wow, I have fruit, I want to eat them, I just can't eat them. I have to first separate them aside, as I did before, a little bit more than 1% of picking these lemons, and then give the portions off, which will separate the portions off, we'll call them a name for the priests and for the Levites, and for the second tithes, on the first, second, fourth, and fifth years, and then finally we can eat, of course, we can eat the lemon tree. Okay, let's continue over here. What happens on the other 2 years I didn't mention? What happens on the third and sixth year? Well, on the third and sixth year, instead of separating out the tithes, we do the regular ones, the truma, which is for the Kohen, and we separate the Maaser, the first tithe, which is for the Levites. That, of course, exists on the third and sixth year as well. But what doesn't exist is the second tithe. Instead of the second tithe on the third and sixth year, we have the tithes for the poor people. So we have to give 10% of our produce to the poor. And this, of course, we can do today because we don't have to worry about it all, unfortunately, finding people that are needy and helping people. So you can always give 1/10 of your produce and find a nice poor person and let him participate, let him have those tithes that you've grown on your tree. Now, what is this whole thing of Tu B'Shvat, which I began? I jumped off talking about the cycle, the 6 years and the 7th year of sabbatical year. But how does this connect, of course, to the cycle, to the Tu B'Shvat Rosh Hashanah, to the new year of Tu B'Shvat. And the answer is that what is special about Tu B'Shvat? On Tu B'Shvat, it is really a cutoff point where most of the rain of the winter has fallen already. That's one of the reasons. There are other reasons as well, but Tu B'Shvat is really a cutoff point. So what are we saying? That all trees right now, again, as I'm looking at my lemon trees. So my lemon trees, for example, that they had these such big fat lemons, how did they become so big and fat? It didn't start from the rains of this year, really. They got their energy and their power from last year's rains that allowed the tree to blossom and give forth to these fruit. And therefore, we consider these lemons not this year. This year we're in the 5th year of this sabbatical cycle. This year is Tafshin Ayin Gimel, which is the 5th year, which is, we give again this year the 2nd tithe. And the 4th year we do as well. So really, it's the same kind of tithe we give, but you can't separate tithes from one year on another year. It has to be separated. So for example, when I'm looking at these lemons, and if I had other fruit that I was saved over and I didn't do Maisa yet, I could only, again, have to make very short to make a cutoff point and say, all these lemons that grew from this year, I can't wait, let's say, keep them in storage and wait till the lemon trees give fruit, start blossoming again, because these lemon trees of mine give fruit a couple times a year, and say, now I'm going to separate from the new lemons on the old lemons. It doesn't work that way. You have to separate between the years. And therefore, the tithe, here on the 4th and 5th year, it's going to be the same kind of tithe, but we still have to separate between them. And what tithe are we going to separate? Again, the 2nd tithe. But what would happen if it was between the 5th and 6th years, like next year, these lemons, let's say we're right now in the 6th year, okay? These lemons will still be considered part of the 5th year because it's still before they came out, something called in Hebrew, chanatah. They sprouted forth and gave already more than 1/3 their full size already, and therefore they would be considered the previous year, although we really entered a new year as far as the calendar, but we still go by the following. That's why it's very important to know the cutoff point. That's what really Tu B'Shvat, on the halachic point of view, is all about. Not only that, we understand as well, there are certain opinions regarding the sabbatical year. What happens after the 7th year sabbatical year is over? As we all know, on the fruit of the 7th year have special holiness to them. What happens on the 8th year, which is the first year of a new cycle? Do we have to wait for Tu B'Shvat before we can actually consider the fruit for the 8th year, which is really the beginning of the new cycle, or they're considered having holiness of Shemitah? And here there are two different opinions. According to what we go by today, is that the minute the Shemitah year goes in, the minute the Shemitah year is over, a new year begins immediately regarding those fruit. So that's a special law. But then again, when we get to Shemitah one day, coming up in a couple of years, we'll talk more about that. But anyway, getting back to our discussion itself, so you have to know, it's very important to know, of course, what the differences are of the trees. Another thing would be when we plant a tree. Of course, when we plant a tree, we know the law is and we're allowed to wait 3 years. We're not allowed to partake of the fruit. And on the 4th year, although we entered the 4th year already, we have to wait only to after Tu B'Shvat before we can eat the fruit. Why? Because the fruit that have grown in the beginning of the 4th year, they're still grown from the power of the rains that came the previous year on the 3rd year, which was prohibited. So you have to wait, of course, till after Tu B'Shvat.